Curious George, the curious little monkey. Here he comes, as happy as can be. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Why is he curious? Well, let's go and see.
Curious George and the maple syrup.
This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. 1986. The Challenger space shuttle explodes shortly after launch, the Iran-Contra affair becomes public, and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant suffers an explosion that floods the area with radiation, becoming the worst nuclear disaster in history. So, a bit of a bummer year. Halley's Comet makes a flyby while the Soviet Union launches the Mir space station, and Pixar is founded. In movie theaters, Top Gun, Aliens, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off, while The Phantom of the Opera begins its run on Broadway. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's Watchmen hit comic book shelves. Madonna's True Blue is the year's best-selling album, and we see the births of Lady Gaga, Drake, and Amanda Bynes. On television, HBO begins the practice of scrambling their signal to crack down on illegal viewing, but that's not enough to stop Captain Midnight from hacking their feed and protesting the channel's prices. The Fox Broadcasting Company launches their own television network. Geraldo Rivera hosts his infamous flop special on the mystery of Al Capone's vault. Alf becomes a thing, and the Disney Channel becomes a 24-hour station. In the world of children's television, we see the premieres of The Real Ghostbusters, Silverhawks, Pound Puppies, Rambo: The Force of Freedom, Zoobilee Zoo, and Pee-wee's Playhouse. And for Nickelodeon, a lot of stuff shifted around. First off, National Amusements, an American theater company, owners of Showcase Cinemas, purchased a controlling interest in Viacom for just shy of $3 billion. Behind the scenes, this meant a lot of changes in upper management, a lot of people vying for power, none of which would be resolved this year.
We got into one of the most difficult battles that I've ever been in my life with management. Management really basically wanted to steal the company. And what really stimulated was when management decided they were going to take the company in a leveraged buyout.
Private?
Yeah,
they were going to take it private.
Private or not, probably would have had public stockholders, but they were going to take it over in a leveraged buyout. I decided I wasn't going to go away, and it was a fierce battle. It was very difficult because we had a so-called independent committee who every time we made a bid tipped them to the bid. So we made a bid, they raised it a quarter, on and on and on.
But publicly, not much seemed to change. Viacom kept its name, and MTV networks kept doing their own thing without any major shakeups or interruptions. On Nickelodeon itself, 5 shows would see their final broadcast this year. National Geographic Explorer wrapped up on January 11th, finding a new long-term home on TBS. The final episode of Livewire hit on May 3rd, leaving Nickelodeon without a children's talk show for the first time in its history. Going Great ended on August 30th, Powerhouse on October 5th, and The Adventures of Black Beauty on December 27th. To replace them, Nickelodeon brought in 7 shows this year for regular rotation, 2 originals, 5 imports. But on top of that, for the summer of '86, Nickelodeon temporarily aired 3 shows from their Nick and Night lineup, calling it Nickelodeon Summer Camp. So, 10 shows. '86 is going to be a busy year for Knacks. But before we get into that, let's walk over to the Nick at Night corner and see what they're up to this year. On March 3rd, Mr. Ed became Nick at Night's new 8 o'clock opener, the silly sitcom antics of a talking horse being a more appealing transition show than My Three Sons, which was bumped up to 8:30. 2 shows were added on May 4th. First, I Spy, a secret agent thriller starring Robert Culp and Bill Cosby, and then The Smother Brothers Show, an odd sitcom where folk act the Smothers Brothers play a publishing executive and an angel. This is not to be confused with the infinitely more well-remembered Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, which had a lot of sharp political satire that got the show abruptly canceled. The Smothers Brothers show only aired for one 32-episode season, so on Nick at Night it only aired on Sundays. Turkey Television became a weekends-only show starting on May 5th, and on November 3rd, The Monkees became the second show to regularly air on Nickelodeon and Nick at Night simultaneously. This tied into the first Nick at Night sponsored contest, Win a Jukebox Full of Monkeys, which was pretty much what it said on the tin. Send in an entry by mail, and 6 grand prize winners get a vintage-style jukebox loaded with Monkees music. And that was your Nick at Night Corner for 1986. But speaking of Nick at Night, let's talk about 6 a.m., when Nick at Night switched back over to Nickelodeon. This is a television no man's land. A lot of people still asleep, and actual children who are up this early are almost certainly in the process of getting ready for school and shouldn't be watching TV, Sarah. Get in the shower, Sarah. I've already made your sack lunch. So it doesn't really matter what you put here. Danger Mouse, The Adventures of Black Beauty, and Going Great all had turns in this dead zone. But on January 30th, 1986, Nickelodeon finally committed a show to the spot. Sort of. This is Curious George.
A trainmaster was moving letters and numbers around on the sign. George came closer. What did those letters and numbers mean? George was curious.
Curious George isn't a show in the strictest sense of the term, but a collection of 104 shorts, all of them 4 minutes long. They were never designed to air as regular programming. They were more for licensing out to package shows and airing during the commercial breaks between shows. And yet, here they are, stacked together like blocks to fill that 6 a.m. time slot. Like Banana Man, Curious George was named in television listings, which qualifies it for a Knacks episode. So, let's get into it. These are the adventures of George, a little monkey without a tail, which makes him an ape, but they keep calling him a monkey, so I guess he's a monkey. George lives with his handler, / best friend, / dad, / the poacher who caught him, the man with the yellow hat. And every day, George goes someplace new and exciting. The fair, the bakery, the farm. However, George is very curious, which means messing around with things he shouldn't and causing a whole lot of trouble. No, George, don't give away all those free tickets. No, George, don't mess with the pretzel salter. No, George, don't knock over that bucket of milk. People get mad at George, so he runs away. But soon a situation arises, and only George can save the day. Hooray! George saved that woman's purse from the roller coaster. Hooray! George stopped the bread slicer from breaking. Hooray! George saved a kitten from a nasty fall. Well, I guess you're a good monkey after all, George. I mean, you're an ape, but sure, you're a good monkey. Of course, you probably all know about Curious George. It's a franchise that's been with us since the 1940s and is still going strong with books, television shows, movies, and merchandise. Curious George is the creation of wife and husband team Margaret and Hans Augusto Rey, 2 German Jews who had spent much of their early married life running away from Nazis. First to Brazil, then trying to make it work in France in 1940, which definitely didn't work, resulting in the 2 of them crossing the French-Spanish border by bicycle with the rough drafts of a couple of children's books they'd been working on, including one about a very curious little monkey, then named Fifi. They had found some success in France, publishing Raffi and the 9 Monkeys in 1939, in which Fifi was a secondary character. By October of 1940, the Rays had found a new home in New York and renewed their effort to break into children's literature. While both partners contributed in every area, Margaret leaned more into business affairs while Hans worked on the creative side of things. They soon got into contact with publisher Houghton Mifflin and secured a very rare 4-book deal, all to be published in the fall of 1941. This included How Do You Get There?, Anybody at Home?, the English version of their first book, now titled Cecily G and the 9 Monkeys, and of course, Curious George. In this first outing, George is a curious little monkey living out in the jungle, but his curiosity gets the better of him when a man in a yellow hat shows up. Soon, George is captured and put on a boat to be taken to a zoo, but he's a slippery little monkey and winds up in a number of hijinks, nearly drowning, then being arrested for calling in a false alarm to the fire department, then flying away using a bunch of helium balloons, until the man in the yellow hat catches him and finally gets him to his new home in the zoo. A funny little animal romp. But, despite its legacy, not an overnight success. It did okay, but was getting outshined in both reviews and sales by things like Holling Clancy Holling's Pedal to the Sea, Virginia Lee Burton's Kaliko the Wonder Horse, and Richard Hubler's biography of Lou Gehrig. Curious George's popularity was a slow burn, and the publishers didn't commission a sequel until 1947, a whole 6 years later. However, the first book remained in print, and sales were slowly ticking up, reaching 10,000 a year by 1958, a whole 17 years since its initial publication. Why was that? Well, in her introduction to The Complete Adventures of Curious George, Anita Silvey, the vice president of Houghton Mifflin between 1995 and 2001, attributes it to older kids passing down these books to their younger siblings, keeping the franchise consistently present in the lives of children. The word of mouth was slow, but the word of mouth never ever stopped. 7 Curious George books were published between 1941 and 1966, cartoony little adventures with plots that feel very stream of consciousness, with the book usually ending in a very distant place to where it began. For example, in the 4th book, Curious George Gets a Medal, published in 1957, the man in the yellow hat gets a letter, which motivates George into writing his own letter. However, when he tries to refill a pen, he spills that ink all over the floor. So George tries to wash the floor with a garden hose, but just winds up flooding the room. So George goes to a nearby farm to steal a pump that could drain the water, but it's too heavy to move. So George also steals a cow to help drag the pump back to the house. But the farmers get mad and chase George into a truck, which drives to the city's museum. Well, George may as well check that out while he's here, so he goes to the dinosaur exhibit, but sees nuts on a tree, and when he tries to get them, he knocks the display down. George gets caught and is in serious trouble when the man in the yellow hat bursts into the room and goes, "Hey George, guess what?
We're shooting you into space."
So they put George into a rocket, shoot him into the upper atmosphere, and just before he's lost into the void of space, George parachutes down. Everyone cheers, George gets a medal, and I'm guessing that room is still flooded. It's fun, and topical as you might guess. The book was published not long after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, but it also feels very make it up as you go. This is just speculation on my part, but if it turned out that they hadn't come up with the rocket stuff until Sputnik happened, I wouldn't be surprised. Trend chasing would continue with the 5th book, Curious George Flies a Kite, published in 1958. Dr. Seuss was pretty much taking over the children's book scene by this point. 1957 was the year of both The Cat in the Hat and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and with them the rise of simplified vocabulary, the act of keeping sentences as short as possible with as small of words as possible. Previous Curious George books were pretty wordy, but for Flies a Kite, the Rays condensed things down to just 219 words. They weren't satisfied with it. It was a fad then, and many educators thought first graders could learn to read quicker that way. Like so many things, it proved to be nonsense, and was given up after a while. Luckily, children never noticed that this book was written differently from the other Curious George books. The series continued to shift into more educational directions with a Curious George alphabet book in 1963 and a book about how hospitals work in 1966, written in direct collaboration with the Children's Hospital Medical Center of Boston. This would be the last of the Margaret and H.A. Ray books, who essentially retired from writing books and went on to where the real money was: merchandise. The 1970s was all about Curious George toys, lunchboxes, clothes, stickers, puzzles, board games. If you could think of it, there was probably a Curious George version of it. It was only natural that a television project would happen. Hans Augusto Rey died on August 26, 1977, at the age of 78, leaving Margaret to run the estate on her own. 2 weeks later, Alan J. Shalleck, a television producer and director, got in touch with Margaret about making 104 Curious George shorts for TV. Shalleck's work went back to the 1950s, most notably Winky Dink and You, a show that encouraged children to draw on their television screens with crayons. Oh, sure, you're supposed to put a piece of vinyl plastic on the screen first, but you know there were kids who skipped that step. Margaret Ray agreed to his offer on the grounds that she would have a great deal of creative control. So, a limited license was given to Milk Train Productions, a new and small animation outfit that had produced nothing. This would be their first and, as we'll see, last project. The next step was funding. Milk Train approached Lafferty, Harwood and Partners, a Canadian investment firm. The agreement was Lafferty and its investors would receive a 50% share of Milk Train's profits from the films and any corresponding merchandise, which, considering the merchandising juggernaut Curious George already was a pretty sweet deal. Margaret Ray stayed hands-on during the production as promised, and she was contracted to receive 10% of revenue. Shalleck would direct at a fee of $500 per short. None of the shorts would be direct adaptations of the original 7 books. 4 minutes just wasn't long enough to do them justice. Instead, Ray and Shalleck spent some long weekends hashing out possible plots, which were then fleshed out by a small team of writers. The first original Curious George stories in over a decade. Margaret Ray would jump around acting the stories out, and he would write them down. She was the monkey. So production began in late 1977, and by early 1979, they weren't anywhere near done, with only 32 of the 104 commissioned shorts completed, and they were already out of money. How did that happen? These shorts are barely animated, refraining from movement whenever possible, and using the absolute minimal amount of drawings when things have to move. 3 drawings for the man in the yellow hat hanging up the phone, 10 drawings of Curious George running down the stairs. Now, this isn't a criticism of the shorts as a product. I get the idea here. It's very much trying to be a living storybook. I'm just saying it shouldn't have been the animation that slowed things down. Nor would it be the voice acting, because there was only one guy. Canadian actor Jack Duffy acted as narrator and performed every character's dialogue.
The passengers were surprised because the captain was still on deck talking to a man with a yellow hat. Who was running the boat? It was George. He was having a great time. He moved the steering wheel slowly at first. Then he began spinning it faster and faster. The ferry began sailing around and around. The captain rushed in. "Who the devil is fooling around up here?" he shouted angrily. As fast as he could, George escaped through the window and climbed to the top of the flagpole.
As far as these kind of things go, you think this would be comparatively a very easy production. However, the relationship between Margaret Ray and Alan Shalleck proved incredibly antagonistic. Margaret became very protective of the Curious George property following her husband's death, and became something of a perfectionist during the production. Shalleck found her incredibly rude and hard to work with. She was a spoiled little child, but people would put up with her because she was so talented. Most great children's books are written by people who are either childlike or childish, and that helps them relate to children and makes the books last. You have to remember, when I knew her, she was in her late 70s. Once when we were having lunch, she asked for a rare hamburger, and when she didn't like it, she was so rude to the waiter that I snatched her wig off and told her to behave. It was next to a spanking. It worked. So the 2 people in charge of the project were bickering children. Production dragged, and soon they were out of money. The only way to pull this off was to ask for more money from Lafferty, Harwood and Partners, but the investment firm would only do so if they completely took over the production, effectively absorbing and dissolving Milk Train Productions. Under new management, production resumed, and in 1982, all 104 shorts were completed, ready to be distributed to television. And the first channel to grab them up was Nickelodeon, to be featured in their headline show, Pinwheel.
"Come on, champ," said the man with the yellow hat. "Let's go home." And so they did.
Hey, Midas! The water's running!
Now, some of the shorts had aired before in Canada during the long production period, but Pinwheel was effectively Curious George's premiere as a complete product. Like most things on Pinwheel, it wasn't educational in the PBS sense. It wasn't about numbers or letters or colors, but I do think it had a lesson to teach kids. And I think it was a bad lesson. As expressed earlier, the Curious George shorts followed a very tight formula. George goes to a fun new place, he gets curious about something, and his curiosity results in him doing something bad. Sometimes it involves property damage, sometimes people almost get hurt. George gets scared and runs away. Then George does something that makes people happy. And when the person that was wronged earlier confronts George about his misdeed, someone else inevitably goes, "Oh, but George did this nice thing, and that makes up for the bad thing he did." And the wronged person goes, "Oh, well, that's okay then."
"That's the monkey who took my tricycle," shouted one of them. "And he pushed in front of us on the high bar," said a girl. The musician came over. "Just a moment," he said. "I've been playing for an hour, but if it wasn't for these two, nobody would have had any fun." "That's him," a driver shouted. "He nearly caused an accident," said another. "Incredible. A monkey riding an elephant down Main Street," said a lady. Just then, the circus people came running in. "That's our lost elephant," said the owner. "Wait, officer. If it wasn't for George, we might never have found him." The man with the yellow hat and the owner of the laundromat had come over. "What you need is a good spanking, George," said the man. "Wait," cried Mrs. Goodman. "I know he made a mess, but he did make up for it. Now the kids can go to the baseball game."
The message of these shorts is that you can do bad things as long as you do an equal number of good things to balance it out. Which is not how it works. Sure, if you mess up and do something bad, oftentimes working to make up for it is a good way to show you're sorry. But George isn't sorry. He never learns why the things he did is wrong. He does things, people get angry at him, and he runs away. The good things he does are oftentimes unrelated to the bad things he does. The world in these shorts seem to run on the good place point system, and as long as George comes out even by the end, it's all good. The best/worst example of this comes in the short Curious George and the Organ Grinder, where George makes friends with a performing monkey, and the two of them steal a bundle of bananas from a fruit stand. Now that's bad. But then they start to perform together for the people in the street, and these people are happy, and that's good. So it all evens out.
The fruit man came rushing over, too. "They stole my fruit," he shouted. "But they're giving us a good show," said a lady in the crowd. "Don't be too angry with them. Look at all the money they made."
So you see, kids, if you're popular and make a lot of money, you can get away with anything, even stealing. George doesn't even learn that stealing is wrong. Stealing is okay as long as you do something that makes people happy. This is a horrible lesson for kids. And it is a lesson. It's repeated, it's enforced, it is a pattern that preschool children will pick up on. Now, you might make a counter-argument that George is not a kid and can't learn like kids can. And that's certainly the case of the original 7 books, the humor of which stems from George being a monkey and not being able to reason like a person. He just goes where the whims take him. It's not about George doing good or bad things. It's about a runaway monkey making a mess because he's silly and a monkey. The shorts, however, seem to make more of an effort to characterize and, well, humanize George. In the books, the man in the yellow hat tries to keep George at home or at the zoo, and then George wanders off. In the shorts, the man in the yellow hat takes George to these places, to these events, and expects him to be an active participant. Also, George goes to school in this show. Like, they straight up send him to public elementary school, and he goes on field trips with the kids and everything. Everyone treats George like a smaller, hairier child, even though George never speaks or wears clothes or anything like that. You could make it a comedy of errors about how an entire town decided to treat a wild animal as a person for some reason, but the shorts definitely aren't going for that. These stories are just treating George with more personhood without really thinking through what that means. Pinwheel ended production in 1984, but Nickelodeon clearly maintained the rights to air the Curious George shorts for a while longer, so here we are again. 4 or 5 shorts stacked on top of each other at 6 in the morning. During that time, 28 of the shorts were adapted into books, with Margaret Ray and Alan Shalleck sharing co-writer credits. Lafferty, Harwood, and Partners went on to produce a number of Curious George VHS tapes through a partnership with Sony Corporations. There was a problem with that, though. As the contracts for these shorts had been written up in the late 70s, no consideration had been made for the home video market, and Margaret Ray wasn't getting a penny from them. A classic problem that has kept a lot of shows away from VHS or DVD, and when they do get a home video release, it's often in a compromised format, usually the music being changed due to music rights not applying to home video. In 1991, Ray sued Lafferty on breach of contract, and won, getting her 10% from VHS sales. Thankfully, the tapes didn't stop, and because of that, the majority of the 104 shorts are available. Curious George aired on Nickelodeon in the 6 a.m. slot all the way until April 1st, 1989, after which the Disney Channel picked up the rights, airing the shorts on Lunchbox. Margaret Ray passed away on December 21st, 1996, at the age of 90. As for Alan Shalleck, well, it didn't turn out great for him. His contract didn't result in residuals, so he couldn't continue to profit off the program. After a number of failed projects after Curious George, Shalleck was bankrupt and out of work by the late 90s. One thing he did was become a professional reader. Under the name of Gramps, he would go to elementary schools, libraries, and bookstores and read to children, oftentimes reading the Curious George books he co-wrote. And then... okay, so this is extreme and ugly and tragic, but also kind of surreal, and definitely not something that children need to listen to. Hey, 5-year-old who clicked this looking for Curious George videos, you're definitely in the wrong place. I need you to shoo right now. Shoo. To make ends meet, Alan Shalleck also advertised gay adult spanking services. You would come to his trailer in Palm Beach County, Florida, pay him, and he would spank you. On February 6, 2006, Shalleck had an appointment with 2 men, but it turns out they weren't there for his services. They were there to rob him. In the struggle, Alan Shalleck was stabbed to death. He was 76. Both men were eventually arrested. They were still listed as one of Shalleck's clients, still in his phone records. They were both sentenced to life in prison without parole. Well, that is definitely a unique note to end things on. There are other Curious George projects, of course, some stop-motion projects, the PBS series, the 2006 movie with Will Ferrell. Curious George has never gone away and has only ever increased in popularity. The shorts certainly helped contribute and maintain that popularity, but it was a lesser version of the franchise. Its lessons not well thought out, its production haphazard, and these days is largely forgotten compared to other versions. That's the thing with the books always being in print. The old and the new is always competing with itself, and there's a reason the books have stuck around. As for Curious George's impact on Nickelodeon, none. Absolutely nothing. It was one of dozens of shorts on Pinwheel and was then used as filler for the 6 a.m. slot. 5 a.m. if you were in Central Time Zone. Nickelodeon viewers barely even knew it existed. But that's just the way things go, especially now that Nickelodeon was a proper 24-hour cable channel. Sometimes you just gotta fill space with whatever you got. Curious George was television spackle. That's hardly sexy, but it had a job to do, and it did it. So, good job, Curious George, I guess.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, our next show is from Australia, which, if you haven't noticed, is in a pretty bad way with its wildlife fires right now. A lot of people and wildlife are being affected, and I don't normally do this, but if you're in a place where you could contribute, I've included a link to the Australian Red Cross disaster relief in the description below. Thank you. Today's research shout-out is Law and Business of the Entertainment Industries. This is a very dry book documenting legal battles in the entertainment industry, but it was important because it included that time Margaret Ray sued Lafferty over VHS tapes, which included a lot of details on the production of the shorts and was basically the keystone to this entire video. But that's hardly thrilling, so I'll also throw in The Journey That Saved Curious George, The True Wartime Escape of Margaret and H.A. Ray by Louise Borden. A great book about Ray's travels during World War II, with lots of photos and illustrations. Less relevant to this video, but still very much worth a read. Thank you all for watching. If you like support Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, perhaps consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to production values, research materials, and helping me move out of Idaho someday. This is my year, I just know it. You can also support the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting that bell icon for notifications, following me on Twitter, sending a one-time donation through Ko-fi or PayPal, and sharing Knacks with all your friends. Welcome to 2020, and welcome to 1986. Let's see how quickly we can get to Double Dare.